Torment of the Interior Life is the subtitle. And so what I'm going to do basically is just read what I've written. If there are comments or questions as I read through my paper, feel free to interject, and then we can have some discussion at the end. Yeah, if you want to take like notes or anything, I suppose nobody brought a notebook, but if you want to make a note on your phone.
And my Bible, just go there.
Sure! Then you may do that. So, all right. Well, just by way of preface, this evening I want to focus upon a concept that I termed manufactured omniscience, which, at least for my part, refers to the embedded idea that is suggested to us by the triad of the internet, the smartphone, and AI assistance. Here is just kind of a summary statement of where the paper is going. I'm going to build up to this by way of a consideration of particular insights from cultural observers, such as Neil Postman, Romano Guardini, and a Frenchman named A.G. Sertillanges. It's probably pronounced something different, but I don't know how to pronounce French. So, and other thinkers such as J.R.R. Tolkien and Augustine. I did have an Aelred of Revo quote in here, but I kind of shaved it back. For you, Mac. Moreover, I will also suggest that manufactured omniscience, made possible by the aforementioned inventions of internet, the smartphone, and AI assistance, if it's used without restraint, has a deleterious effect on our interior life. All of those things will be defined further as we go through. So the first section is titled Embedded Ideas, Insights from Neil Postman. Neil Postman is a cultural critic from the 20th century. He wrote a book called The Disappearance of Childhood, another book titled Amusing Ourselves to Death, from which, this opening quote is taken from another book called Technopoly, probably some others that I'm not aware of. But he's sort of in the tradition of those who are not really saying in a kind of reductionistic way that tech is bad, but are at least sort of giving some insight and caution into the effects or the manner in which the things that we invent, which are considered to be techie tech, so to say, have negative effects on our humanity. Hence the title, The Inhumanity of Manufactured Omniscience, is to suggest that this concept that I'll elucidate further in a moment is doing something at odds with what it means to be a human person, with what it means to be a creature, with what it means to be made to the image and the likeness of God. And so in this first section, I have an insight from Neil Postman. Here's a quote from Amusing Ourselves to Death. He makes this observation about any new invention, quote, "In every tool we create, an idea is embedded that goes beyond the function of the thing itself. It has been pointed out, for example, that the invention of the eyeglasses in the 12th century not only made it possible to improve defective vision, but also suggested the idea that human beings need not accept as final either the endowments of nature or the ravages of time. Eyeglasses refuted the belief that anatomy is destiny by putting forward the idea that our bodies as well as our minds are improvable." And then he makes this assertion, which you may or may not agree with. "I do not think it goes too far to say that there is a link between the invention of eyeglasses in the 12th century and gene-splitting research in the 20th. I mean, inasmuch as both pursuits, the invention of the eyeglasses, which is, let's say, improving some aspect of a deficient human anatomy, and gene-splitting therapy is basically, let's say, within the orbit of eugenics or something, right? So he's drawing a through line between those two things, saying that there is an idea that basically undergirds or is embedded in the invention of eyeglasses, which is also embedded or implicit or undergirding the gene-splitting research of the 20th century. Now again, one need not agree with Postman's conclusion about the link between eyeglasses and gene-splitting research. I obviously find it compelling. I think it's true, which is why I put the quote in the paper. And of course, on the other hand, one need not agree with Postman and thereafter take off his glasses and smash them on the ground just because there is an embedded idea in the invention of the eyeglasses from the 12th century that everybody from the 12th century would roundly condemn as an egregious excess in human ingenuity if it were to undergird something like gene-splitting research or some other form of eugenics, right? Where you're trying to basically breed the optimal human. In other words, even though that idea is embedded in the 12th century invention of the eyeglasses, it doesn't mean that those from the 12th century would just say, well, let that embedded idea sort of run loose and do all sorts of other things that may be beyond comprehension or beyond some kind of something that is morally allowable. What is most illuminating here in Postman's assertion is that every new invention has an embedded idea in it that goes beyond the mere function of the invention itself. It's of course very likely that any inventor or tool maker does not really realize, nor does he think about the embedded idea, but is only seeking to solve a problem. And so he invents a tool whose function solves for problem X. But unbeknownst to him, of course, there is embedded in that idea Y. As embedded, it is latent, it is inchoate, and it perhaps does not unfold itself, is not discovered, is not made clear until some later time, at which point one may come to see that an embedded idea of one sort or another needs an obvious limiting principle so that it doesn't just spiral out of control and do things that we find morally reprehensible. Nevertheless, the embedded idea outpacing certain other important considerations, that is, in this case, the question of ethic in view of capability. In other words, just because I can do something doesn't mean I ought to do it, or I at least ought to ask the question, if I can, ought I? And so that consideration is virtually being outpaced in our present time, I would argue, in very many other ways. So again, nevertheless, the embedded idea outpacing those important considerations may very well lead to unforeseen nightmarish inventions. Or worse yet, if not a nightmarish invention, an embedded idea that whispers to man about his limitless potential, which is itself nightmarish. Right? And to just use this kind of restrained view of Postman respecting the issue of the invention of eyeglasses, suggesting to man that anatomy is not destiny, that human existence is improvable. I mean, we could think of countless other examples in our own day and age, in the manner in which that is pursued, right? You have your shirt on, Unborn Lives Matter. That, you know, the child sacrifice industry participates in some way in this notion of, that life is improvable by way of certain technological advances. And so we just have to at least be aware of the fact that there are these kind of embedded ideas or notions that are undergirding the things that we're producing, and then suggesting things to us that we may not be thinking about as critically as we ought to. Okay. So here's some further illustrations in this respect. Part 2, sailboats and motorboats, insights from Romano Guardini. Take an example also from the 20th century Roman Catholic philosopher Romano Guardini. In his work, Letters from Lake Como, explorations in technology and the human race. He considers the effect of certain human inventions on man's relation to nature. Some inventions, he says, draw man into closer communion with the world he has been given to steward. Some others may very well sever man's recollection from his place in the created world. One such consideration of Guardini contrasts a sailboat on the one hand and a gas-powered boat on the other. He calls the sailboat an embodiment of natural culture, and the gas-powered boat, he says, creates something of an artificial situation that he asserts decisively eliminates nature. And this is what he means. In Guardini's view, we have real culture, which he defines as elevation above nature, yet a decisive nearness to nature, when we invent things that necessarily capture and cooperate with natural forces in order to fulfill the intended purpose of the invention. And so to apply this to these examples, the sailboat is an invention that keeps man tethered to the wind and the waves, even as he masters and captures them by a particular combination of wood and linen. The idea embedded in such an invention as a sailboat is that while man is master of and exercises a certain degree of dominion over creation, he is nevertheless a part of creation and is limited by his place in relation to the rest of God's world. The gas-powered boat, by contrast, allows for man to be somewhat aloof of the wind and the waves, removed, as it were, from his proper place in the created world. And for this reason, the industrial mechanism allows man to power the vessel against the purpose of the wind and the waves. That obviously has its own limitations. But the point here is that the sailboat sort of has to cooperate with where the wind is blowing. But if I'm in a gas-powered boat, I can just sort of cut against that consideration, right? Because the engine is allowing me to propel forward in a way that perhaps the sailboat wouldn't allow. And so in turn, man's participation with and limitation within the created world begins to be forgotten under those considerations. And so Guardini observes this: once there was an order, a living space which made possible human existence in a specific sense. And that specific sense was suggested to man by way of his natural limitations, the manner in which he is anchored to creation. The gas-powered boat, however, suggests something else, that man need no longer creatively master and capture things in creation, stewarding them to some good cultural purpose. He now has the ability to exist either in indifference to his smallness compared to various natural forces, or otherwise to exercise a kind of cruel dominance on the natural world, twisting it solely to the advance of his own transcendence above his creaturely place. The point of man's interaction with the created world, in that way, loses its interpenetrative aspect. In other words, on the one hand, man shows himself as steward of creation, as the one who has dominion over it, and with a certain kind of tool, creation aids in the humility of the steward through the hard edges of reality. Like, I'm not advocating that we not use gas-powered boats. I obviously drove here in a car. And when I cleared the driveway today, I didn't use a shovel, I used a snowblower. Right? You know, what's that? Yeah. but there's no doubt, you know, as I'm going to point out here in a moment, that the shovel would have communicated my limits much more than the snowblower, because I can just push a lever and it shoots the snow out versus having to kind of break my back in order to move the snow otherwise. So with certain kinds of tools, certain kinds of inventions, that interpenetrative aspect of man's relation to creation isn't necessarily lost. He's cooperating together with it while mastering it, and yet in a way that creation is also humbling him as he does it. But as man's ingenuity makes him more capable, as it exceeds in power, it may also aim to exceed the limitations of the created world, reimposing nearly reimagining what reality actually is. And so for Guardini, the problem is not necessarily in the mechanism per se, as though there's something inherently bad about a motorboat that you power with gasoline. But like Postman, even if he states it in a different way, the primary issue for Guardini is the idea embedded therein, what it suggests to man as it's used. Or perhaps it might also be right to say that Guardini's concern was man's ignorance of the way any mechanism suggests possibilities beyond its mere use. That is, just using these things in a kind of thoughtless way, not even understanding that there may be a negative reciprocation in the use of certain kinds of mechanisms, certain kinds of tools. Another example, the industrial mechanism of a backhoe is a vastly greater strengthening of man's natural faculties than would be a tactile tool like a shovel. But what comes along with the outsized extension of man's natural faculties is the suggested idea and goal of harnessing a kind of limitless power, or at least a power that can be aloof of certain limitations. So long as man is ignorant respecting this potential effect, he remains in danger of falling prey to it. For the use of a shovel actually does communicate to man his limits, and so forcibly removes this kind of ignorance. Blisters will eventually form that indicate to the man that he should cease activity for a time. His back cries out, his shoulders burn, his grip begins to slacken. There we might call the experience one of friction, creation aiding in the steward's humility. It might also be called man's dialogue with creation. But on the other hand, if man can functionally bypass the manner in which the created world limits him, becoming ignorant of the aforementioned danger, well, he begins to think less on his limitations, or even begins to see such limitations as negative constraints that, like the created world itself, need finally to be overcome so as to be nearly forgotten. Here there is what we might call frictionlessness. And without friction, not humility, but a kind of unrestrained pride. This we might also call man's monologue with himself. He doesn't have the created world causing friction, acting as a buffer against himself. So in the invention of tools, there is always this sort of tendency to try to exceed what we see as deficiencies. And maybe there are deficiencies because of the fall, right? And maybe there are some inventions that we might create that exist within a proper boundary, but we can't go from eyeglasses to transhumanism, right? We can't go from, I fix my vision, to I'm going to upload my consciousness to the metaverse with Mark Zuckerberg and create my own universe or whatever. That actually cuts against the goodness of what it means to be a human creature within the limitations of what it means to be a human person in the creation that God has set us in. And so, in this regard, Guardini observes further, contemporary man has not been trained to use power well, nor has he, even in its loosest sense, an awareness of the problem itself. He seems alert to the crisis of power today only in its limited external dangers, such as clearly arose during the recent war, that is, World War II. So Guardini is there saying that man clearly understands the limited external dangers that power can produce. You know, the high casualty rate, the dropping of a nuclear bomb. But that's not quite perceptive enough, because again, there are ideas and notions that are standing behind some of these things that are much worse. And so again, the problem is not with power. The problem is not with capability, but is with a nearly thoughtless, ignorant use of it, in which man is wielded by what he thinks he is wielding. I think it's Henry David Thoreau who says, we have become the tools of our tools. That is, The things we're making are using us. And he said that before the internet, okay, which is what we're ultimately coming to. Okay. And additionally, then, the problem is in what is suggested to man by what he wields. And so again, the problem itself is not primarily the limited external dangers that an ignorant or thoughtless use of power may cause, however ruinous such dangers may well be. But the real problem is the ignorance and thoughtlessness themselves. The problem worse, if there were something worse than the effect of nuclear annihilation, is what man's capability of creating a nuclear bomb suggests to him about his own ill-conceived and vainly imagined limitlessness. That false notion, which is the truly dangerous thing, carried on through time, will only beget and create further inventions to advance unrestrained power. The manner in which man allows an embedded idea to drive him, then, is the most pressing issue, which is the thing least thought about. We only think about the negative, deleterious consequence when it actually takes place. We don't necessarily take heed to what actually led to the possibility of this thing. Okay. Part 3, the need then for an ethic. Further insights from Guardini. Guardini writes, the present lack of an ethic for controlling power's use tends to breed further illusion. The use of power is accepted simply as another natural process. End quote. But if the use of power is removed to just another natural process, it is also by definition removed from the question of ethics, inasmuch as natural processes simply happen prior to the question of right or wrong. In other words, a tree grows. That is a natural process, but it is not right or wrong within the frame of ethics, even though one ought to consider it good, because it proceeds after the order of treeness. That's what trees do, and God has designed them to do. But the use of power is not like the growing of a tree, right? The use of power in the manner Guardini means is a directed use of power by persons, and therefore it implies intentionality. That is, a mind that intends some purpose. And so the ethic for controlling power's use is just that. Not a control of power per se, but power's use, which is then to say an ethic to control the user, man. Or, in this case, to control the inventor, to control the tool maker, that he has certain considerations that constrain what he may do. Okay? There may be certain ethical forms, for example, of assistance with those who are having difficulty getting pregnant, but there are other forms that are off the table, which lead to human death. And so it's the question of whether or not we have an ethic that we can bring to bear upon the one who is making use of these things or not. Okay, so the ethic must include then a constant retelling of man as creature, dispelling the recurring temptation of man as though he were creator, man as God. Where such retelling is silenced, where man is not re-impressed by the assertion that he is not God, that he is a creature, where that is silenced and suppressed, well, man's use of power becomes unrestrained. Or to say it another way, man tries to put power to use as though he were God, which is, first of all, impossible, and second of all, leads to self-destruction. J.R.R. Tolkien observed that as creatures, we have the impulse to create, and yet we find we cannot create in an absolute sense. That is to say that we cannot bring things into existence out of nothing, and so we are limited by what is already available to us. In such a case, then, he says we can be sub-creators. But when the sub-creator forgets the sub, this is the first step away from an ethic that seeks to restrain man for his good, even though man is often of the view that restraint is to restrict in an imprisoning manner. Here, restrain would mean to direct man to what is fitting for him as a creature made in the image and the likeness of God. To prevent a child who does not know how to swim from jumping into the deep end of the pool is a restraint. It is good, because again, without that restriction, they will drown. And so an ethic ought to seek to restrain man in this good way, limiting him to where he can flourish, mitigating as much negative reciprocation as possible. The use of power without the tempering of an ethic causes man to see creation simply as in the way. Causes man to see creation as a thing to be mastered, not by way of a God-pleasing cooperation and stewardship, but a perverse God-like use or setting aside of such inconvenient limits. So like to us, a guy like Tolkien sounds like an environmentalist and a lib because he loved trees and he absolutely hated industrialization. But I think the reason why he loved trees and hated industrialization is because he saw industrialization as an unrestrained use of power that only seeks to get out of the natural world or the created world something that will enrich and benefit man. Not what will, so like I just finished The Return of the King. I'm close to it actually. They come to the end and there is this scourging of the Shire. And in the Shire, they love the trees and they love the natural world. And Saruman goes there and like cuts all the trees down and starts to basically destroy all the wonderful things of the hobbits and then build all these ugly buildings and then try to make the land profitable. And then the hobbits come back from defeating Sauron and then they drive Saruman out. And again, to us, who maybe are partial to certain kinds of industrialization, that sounds like, oh, well, he must have been like a green world, crazed earth advocate or something. Yeah. But that wasn't the case. He just had concerns for this very thing, which is man going from the place of sub-creator to creator in his mind, and then being, let's say, totally thoughtless in the manner in which he interacts with the natural world.
No boundaries.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the setting aside of limits then is a concern not only in relation to overcoming anatomical deficiencies, as in the case of gene-splitting research, nor only in regard to the question of man's relation to the created world, as in mechanisms that create, again, what Guardini calls an artificial situation. But this concern for limits has also to do with mechanisms that relate to what I have called our interior life. That is to say, that relate to our faculty of knowing, that relate to our heart and our mind, to our soul. Here too, especially in the 21st century, we have an artificial situation made possible by certain inventions, of which I already named, the internet, the smartphone, and AI, that, as I would like to suggest, manufacture omniscience. That is to say, give the a mechanized tool may cause man to be aloof of his limitations within creation. Some of our mechanisms for knowing cause us to be aloof of how we should restrain that faculty so that we don't imagine that we can know all things or try to pursue every possible thing that we may know and what negative effects it may have. So part 4, titled Manufactured Omniscience. As with eyeglasses, gene-splitting research, sail and motorboats, shovels and backhoes, we have another set of inventions thoughtfully to contend with, and what is more, with the embedded idea that goes beyond their mere function. I again refer here to the internet, what might be thought of as a new power. That's kind of what internet is. It's a power or an energy. It's like it's almost like electricity or natural gas or something. It is a power, and the principal tool that harnesses that power very effectively, namely the smartphone, and finally the further addition of AI assistance. The introduction of the smartphone and AI assistance has more effectively harnessed the internet's unknown power and unspecified goal than desktop computers and Ask Jeeves or even Google search of yesteryear. We sort of entered into a kind of new situation in this regard. I mean, nothing is new under the sun, but obviously there are contexts in which we're having to contend with things that we didn't have to contend with before. And these things are, as I'm going to suggest, more powerful than I think we really even understand, that we even have the ability to comprehend. So in a kind of post-Mannian manner, we might observe that the triad of the internet, the smartphone, and AI assistance not only make it possible for man to know more things, but suggests the idea that the expanse of man's mind can be furthered, the limit of his knowing extended, the horizon of his seeing stretched, as far as such inventions permit. Vistas that in some way, because of their indeterminateness, seem limitless, infinite, and hence manufacture that all-knowing attribute of God that we call omniscience. Moreover, the embedded idea in these things, internet, smartphones, AI assistants, is that limits on what or how much one can know is automatically seen as a negative defect, rather than seeing it as a characteristic good of what it means to be a human person. In other words, we should think it a good, just as we should think it a good that we are limited in certain physical ways and be humbled by that in our relation to God, so we should think of our limited way of knowing, sans inventions that perhaps again suggest to us that we can extend that knowledge as characteristic goods, not inherent defects of human nature.
I'm going to try really hard not to derail this too much, but I can't stop thinking about the printing press and access to God's Word, which he brought his Bible.
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
So pause.
I'm triggered.
Yes. Good.
Just let you know, man.
I knew you would.
Lutherans and printing presses?
I know.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
why should we have access that we should have to go to you?
Yeah. We'll come to that.
Okay.
So combine this phenomena together with the innate curiosity, our desire to know of human persons, absent a proper ethic that helps man to live toward his created limitations even here in the realm of knowledge, and we have quite a precarious situation which causes deleterious effects to man's interior life, as I want to suggest. Again, the more acutely artificial a situation is made by an invention, the greater likelihood there is for man to begin to be frustrated rather than to rejoice in his limitations. Like I was really irritated this morning because when I was snow blowing my driveway, which is much easier than shoveling, I discovered that the city had whacked my mailbox and it was in the ditch. And I won't repeat here what I said. But then by the time I got back to the house, I was like, you know, actually, I guess it's good to be humbled because at least this snowblower is throwing the snow and I don't have to break my back to do it. But there were like a bunch of things. Like I had a flat tire, as I mentioned to you. My mailbox had been shellacked by the city. My wife, my poor wife, she went to the grocery store and got 5 dozen eggs, and like literally 24 of them were broken when we went to the box. And then at the same time we discovered that Ailred dumped over a thing of sugar all into her pantry. It was just like a series of them. But so those are all kind of limitations, right? That one is often frustrated by rather than rejoicing in, because that's part of what it means to be a human being who lives within the limitations of this world. Okay. It must be observed that, of course, every tool, inasmuch as it functions to extend some faculty in man, by definition not only strengthens and extends some part of man, but also suggests that there is something weak or deficient, we may say less critically, limited in what characterizes his natural state. I had to have this bottle opened with a bottle opener because my hands are too weak.
Amen.
Maybe not yours, but too weak to pop it open. So there already is that implication or suggestion from a tool that we have certain limitations in and deficiency. Even an invention like the sailboat or the shovel which more effectively cooperate and have a kind of dialogue with creation than respectively do the motorboat or the backhoe, suggests the deficiency in trying simply to swim across the sea or to dig out a pool in your backyard with nothing but your hands. And there is nothing inherently wrong with this, and invention, tool-making, is part of the manner in which man exercises the God-imparted image and likeness of God. And yet it is a question of restraint. It is a question of sobriety. Postman's assertion that there is a through line between the eyeglasses and gene-splitting research, advanced by the suggestion that man need not accept as final either the endowments of nature or the ravages of time, Mac, finds its corollary in the through line between the printing press and the age of the internet, smartphones, and AI. Knowing this, despite the embedded idea in each of these inventions from the 12th and 15th centuries, we who need them no more want to smash our eyeglasses than we want to burn our books. In other words, there is an embedded idea in the printing press that I think to some degree undergirds and is embedded in other technologies that we invent for the purpose of knowing, right? So there is a through line there. Yet, of course, we must be mindful of the embedded idea, is what I'm calling for. Thoughtfulness as opposed to ignorance. And thus, again, it comes down to whether or not man can thoughtfully bring a limiting principle to bear upon himself in his inventiveness. So the crux of the issue is whether or not man can responsibly wield power. For every invented mechanism or tool is the result or the exercise of power. That is, the exercise of ability or ingenuity or expense of inventiveness and energy. To refer back to Romano Guardini, it is the blanket assumption that the use of power is simply another natural process that undergirds man's lack of awareness of the problem itself of an uncritical exercise of power. That is, simply thinking of the exercise of power as a natural process, assuming that is the case, makes us ignorant and thoughtless. And of course, the uncritical exercise of power with respect to the aforementioned triad of the internet, smartphone, and AI assistance is exacerbated by curiosity, which, if unrestrained, can use this triad in ways that torment the interior life. Part 5, the perversity of unrestrained curiosity, insights from Augustine. In his Confession, St. Augustine suggests that sins are perverse imitations of God's characteristics and attributes. He applies this to various things such as pride, ambition, the cruel use of power, or, in his case, the sin of stealing pears, as he says, not for his own need, but simply for the love of sinning. So, for example, of pride he writes, "For thus doth pride imitate high estate, whereas thou alone art God, high above all." And of the cruel use of power he writes, "The cruelty of the powerful wishes to be feared, but who is to be feared but God only?" And of his own sin in stealing the pears, he reflects that he was perversely imitating God's omnipotence. A particular interest here are the remarks that he makes about curiosity, that is, a desire to know. He writes, "Curiosity affects a desire for knowledge, whereas it is thou who supremely knowest all things." Further, Augustine notes that besides that concupiscence of the flesh, which lies in the gratification of all senses and pleasures, there is another form of temptation more complex in its peril. And that temptation, more complex in its peril, is this kind of unrestrained curiosity, a need to know beyond the proper limits of human knowing. Before I go on, just apply that remark to the manner in which you treat your children. You understand, quite, I think, acutely, that there is a limit on what children ought to know, given the particular age that they might have. Yeah. So your kid asks you a question about subject A that you think is not appropriate for a 7-year-old to know, and you say, "I'll tell you about that later." And yet you see in him what is in all of us, which is as soon as you say, "I'll tell you later," he thinks, "You're going to tell me, I'm going to try to figure out." right? Like, I won't mention the child that it is, but one of my children is very keen to listen to adult conversations that he knows. I have 4 boys, so I guess you can narrow it down pretty quickly. That he knows he should be listening to, but there is this kind of innate interest, a curiosity, a desire to know things that you know, especially you shouldn't know. Okay. So when I say the temptation, more complex in its peril, is that kind of unrestrained curiosity, a need to know beyond the proper limits of human knowing. It's this kind of unrestrained curiosity, Augustine would posit, is a perverse imitation of God's omniscience, of God's ability to know all things. Okay.
Do you think Eve eating the fruit would be more curiosity or more pride?
The next paragraph addresses that. Probably both.
Read the notes.
Okay, so the temptation to know in the manner that God knows was, of course, the primal original sin. Quote from Genesis 3:5, the devil says, For God knows, right? God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil, whispers the devil. He whispers still. And now, corrupted by sin, man is all the more curious, all the more suggestible, all the more desirous to know, and to know and to know. As then in the garden, so now, in a manner of speaking, in the desert. The devil draws mankind into a kind of unrestrained curiosity to know in a way that is not proper to his humanness, which is, by virtue of what it is, limited. In a book called The Intellectual Life, A.G. Serta-Longs asserts that knowledge, as he addresses it in this work, is a human habitation. And as a human habitation, knowledge ought to be pursued in a human way. The acquisition of knowledge, Serta-Longs maintains, is to accord with principles of harmony, that is, things being held in a kind of balance, and the order of the mind, both of which ought to correspond to the order of things, or the order of reality. This human habitation of knowledge, like man's impulse to create, is a reflection of man's relation to God. However, even as man is not and cannot be creator, but only sub-creator, just so is it impossible for man to be knower, capital K, yet he is, in a manner of speaking, a sub-knower. Like creativity, knowledge is a human habitation because both are, first, a divine habitation, in a manner of speaking. Or better to say in this case, knowledge or wisdom is not just a divine habitation, but a person, the person of the Son of God. Man has been given the great privilege and the gift to sub-know, but he must pursue it in a way that is appropriate to a sub-knower. Even as a child needs to approach the matter of knowledge in a way that is appropriate to himself. And I've had to have, these are good conversations actually to have with children. It's a kind of test of humility. In regard to your question, Josh, I do think that there is a swell of pride, in Eve, saying, he knows something I don't know, and for some reason I have hatched the idea that I have a right to know what he knows that I don't now know. And that's what the child thinks when they perceive that you're withholding something from them, and they think they have a right to know it. So we have, in the same way, let's say, the responsibility to be humbled by this category of sub-knowing, to know in a way that is appropriate to ourselves.
Professor?
Yes?
So, to predict your next paragraph,
Yes.
so why did God not condemn Solomon
What do you mean?
for asking for wisdom? To know more.
Well, wisdom isn't necessarily to know more. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, right?
Fair.
So,
But he was given great wisdom, knowledge.
yeah, well, the prohibition on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil wasn't a prohibition on knowledge itself, right? It was a prohibition to know in a particular kind of way. Like, so when I say to my son, you may not know about subject X, that doesn't mean I want him to know about nothing, right? he's gonna exercise restraint in that regard, and then as he matures, maybe he has the capacity to know more of what for now is being withheld from him. In the case of Solomon, he prays for wisdom so that he might rule such a great people. So he's asking in that way, particularly with respect to his vocation as king. Not just give me all knowledge that you possess.
Omniscience,
Yeah, but give me wisdom to do that which I have been given to do. So,
One of the things I was thinking of was place.
yeah,
So to know one's place,
yes,
Satan fell because he wasn't content with his own place.
right.
And so knowing the place and manner of when you're responsible enough for such knowledge
Right,
and being content
yes,
in that place
yep.
is a struggle we all are tempted with.
Yes, right. Well, and the desire to go from sub-creator to creator is a discontent of position, right? It's really in some way no different than, the guy who has been recently hired for a business mouthing off to his boss. It's like, dude, you're fired, because you can't do that. You have to know your place. You have to know your order. There may be some things that unfold to you, and as you build credibility, perhaps, you can say the things that you're now saying, but not now, right? So you're right, yeah, precisely. And in the conclusion of the paper, I'll come back to those sorts of things in terms of knowing according to one's responsibility, and in accord with one's vocation, in accord with one's place, and so forth. Okay.
You already spoke ahead.
Yeah, so you're predicting, right?
That's right.
You just think this is going to a total train wreck, is why you keep cutting Josh off. Yeah. All right. In our own day, many see that information of certain kinds. Oh, wait, sorry. It is the case, however, that in the information age, which has also become something of an age of suspicion, any suggestion to the contrary, that is, that perhaps it is better for the interior life to know less things, is immediately suspected of a kind of deceptive withholding. As soon as the devil said, "For God knows," there a seed of evil suspicion is planted, which grows into curiosity, and curiosity unrestrained gives birth to the belief that something was being withheld. And so the hand was held out to grab hold of what was forbidden. In our own day, many see that information of certain kinds has indeed been deceptively withheld. Have we not? Epstein files or whatever. Okay, so the mind then, under those conditions, reels to know more of what has been suggested, perhaps, that man consider less, and for the very reason he is told he ought to consider things less, or at the very least he ought to consider less things. Immediately when you tell somebody that who wants to know more, they think, he knows something that he doesn't want me to find out, right? They don't just give themselves permission to know less and to be at peace, but they think there's something being withheld, which, again, under certain contexts, that may actually be true, but that doesn't mean it's true in every respect. Okay. Sir DeLong's writes, you cannot be charitable in every direction at once, and so it is with curiosity or knowing. In this regard, one must keep in mind that God's omniscience is limitless and yet also ordered, whereas if man's is to be ordered, it must be limited. Man's manufactured omniscience is seemingly limitless, and yet it is quite chaotic, not only in the blunderbuss of information that we are fed, but our own inability to properly order all that we take in. Earlier inventions, like a printed book, in which the embedded idea that man's mind is improvable, expandable, nevertheless have a point of friction, namely the demand of attentiveness. Like there's a point of friction in reading a book in the evening, because you just can't, right? You can't. Maybe I can hold my attention watching some stupid movie until 11 p.m., but I can't read a book till 11 p.m. Okay. Our knowing machines can be used with a greater degree of frictionlessness, a greater degree of passivity, for we can swipe, change tabs, have multiple open at the same time. The variables are endless, really, and they are manufactured so that we can know and know and know. And yet consider the restlessness caused by an attempt to know in this seemingly limitless way. There is no rest or quiet in such one, even when he tries to make space for rest and quiet. Describing a habit of allowing curiosity to be driven by the distraction of things that demand our attention, demand to be known, Augustine again writes in his Confessions, quote, "For when this heart of ours is made the receptacle of the most minute and contemptible things with which is our curiosity daily tempted, and bears crowds of this abounding vanity, then our prayers often interrupted and disturbed thereby. And whilst in thy presence we direct the voice of our heart to thine ears, this so great a matter is broken off by the influx of I know not what idle thoughts." In other words, Augustine is saying, even when I try to steal away to the prayer closet, so to say, there is an influx of I know not what idle thoughts that steal the possibility of silence and prayer. And we'll get to what he's describing in a moment compared to what we have to contend with, but just sort of keep that in mind. The dam breaches, and one finds that he cannot escape the influx of idle thoughts, even when he tries to escape them. David, for his part, holds out this confidence in prayers in Psalm 32. "For this cause everyone who is godly shall pray to you in a time when you may be found. Surely in a flood of great waters they shall not come near him." And yet here, attempting to imbibe all that unrestrained curiosity suggests, the flood of the great waters of intrusive thoughts do reach the one who tries to shut them out. Such is the one who tries to know in a way not suited to his limited place as a limited creature. So to your point, Eric, that he has a place suited to himself. Thus one can observe that a kind of unrestrained curiosity, a desire to know and know and know, causes restlessness precisely for this fact. It is an attempt of a limited creature, a limitedly knowing mind at going beyond what has been deemed a deficiency. For Augustine's part, he complains that his curiosity is arrested by, quote, a lizard catching flies or a spider entangling them as they rush into their net. To us, this sounds quite quaint. It's almost boring, really, and yet it suggests in its simplicity how troublesome a situation we find ourselves in given the attempt and relative success to manufacture omniscience through the combination of internet, smartphone, and AI assistant, along with a kind of unrestrained, perverse curiosity. If Augustine was distracted by flies, we the more so by Beelzebub, the lord of the flies, who has more infinitely distracted us with the endless buzzing about of information, whether it be information of import or not, whether it be actually important or completely mundane and stupid. It's like you see all these podcasters making videos about one another, and I catch myself watching them sometimes, and I'm like, this is just like high school drama on the internet. Why am I watching this? Like my brain is literally turning to mush.
You think it's drawn into
So,
it.
like the real world, YouTube, you know,
Reaction.
Yes, right. It's like what's that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, Inception? You're like 4 layers deep, and you're like, how did I get here? Okay, in any case, and what is more, not just distracted, okay, this is the point, which is a vice in its own right, but we are also convinced that we can know infinitely, which, as it seems, has worse outcomes. The angst and the interior suffering of the masses suggests that this kind of knowing cannot be engaged in without serious negative repercussions. It is akin to an overcharged battery. Such does not need less or more energy, but the appropriate amount. Less with too little, it fails to power, or with too much, it fails to be able to hold a charge. We are finite, limited creatures whose knowing capacity is by definition then limited, and yet the voltage of knowing, internet, smartphone, AI, in a manner of speaking, is limitless. An input that fries the interior life of man and thereafter causes him to suffer in all manner of ways exteriorly. It may be that this nexus, this meeting of the internet, smartphone, AI assistance, and man's impulse to know, need not overcharge one in this way, even as a gas-powered boat need not make man aloof of his limitations and place within creation. But so long as such a concern is dismissed as an impossibility, so long as it's not even thought of, or it's completely ignorant, or we're completely ignorant in regard to this, well then the peril to man's interior life will inevitably occur and recur. As I think we see, right? People are, it's like, who's that social commentator, Jonathan Haidt? I think there's a book called The Anxious Generation or something like that. I can't remember what the title of it is, but it's like, we're like the most medicated generation, and yet we're still the most unhappy, we're the most anxious, we're the most depressed.
With all the most information.
That's right, yeah. And the least amount of wisdom, which is kind of a...
Which one of me, man? That was nice.
Yeah. So,
It's fair.
okay. Part of the solution, though not the whole of it, is that we now have to give ourselves permission to know less, or at least to refuse to know more than we can meaningfully or helpfully know. We must rediscover even how to order our knowing properly and define what the final goal of knowing is. We must argue against the internal angst of the false accusation that one commits sins of omission for simply refusing to participate with the intent of the knowing machine that attempts to manufacture omniscience. In short, we have to fight for the goodness of being a human creature, for being limited. That is to say that you get the impression from some people that because you can know something that's going on, that you don't know about it is a demerit. And that's a lie, especially when it comes to things that are definitionally local circumscribed events, but which certain news outlets propagandize and act as though they are global phenomena. So suddenly you have people in the UK protesting for a guy named George Floyd who died because he was a drug addict. No one should have known about that. It was pure propaganda, and people made it seem like you are committing a sin of omission if A, you didn't know that happened, or B, you didn't care about it. And I was in category B, and I wish I had been in category A, frankly. Not because I think it's good when people die, but how in the world would I have otherwise known that? Than that I have an invention that can put it in front of my face, call my attention to it, and then I have a bunch of chirping birds saying, did you hear about this thing that happened in Minnesota? I lived in north central Montana at the time. What? Did the people in Minnesota hear about this guy in north central Montana who died on the side of the road? Probably not, froze to death or whatever. You know what I mean? It's just like that kind of pressure, social pressure, to know and to know and to know. The impression that you're, again, committing a sin of omission if you just say, not interested, I'm not going to participate in this activity, where I'm just, it's like George Orwell's 1984. I didn't put this example in here, but I can't remember what he calls them, but it's like the 10 minutes of hate or something, where the telescreen just kind of shows everybody this image that gets everybody's passions inflamed, and then they just like, they're just like yelling at the thing, and everybody's getting angry. And he writes that in 1948, very prescient, to note in the manner that propaganda, if it is able to be amplified, can just capture people. And we have that feeling that because we can know, we must know. Like when Trump started doing these strikes in Iran, we were having a birthday party for my son who turned 1, and I didn't know anything about it because, I'm one of these people who commits sins of omission in this regard quite often. And my dad starts talking about it to me and I'm like, what happened? I'm just celebrating this kid's first birthday. I didn't realize that this was going on. Maybe it's good to kind of get apprised of things like that, but at the moment I wasn't like, oh, I gotta know. You see what I'm saying? All right, to go back to Augustine, it is not that the use of power is itself perverse. Would you get that knowing machine out of here? No. I
wasn't paying to do that. I was like, this is awesome.
It's the
better example.
It's a group chat.
Yeah. Totally be quiet. No, to go back to Augustine, it is not that the use of power is itself perverse, though it can be used perversely. It is not to say that curiosity, a desire to know, is itself perverse, though again it can be perverted and seeking boundlessly to break inherent and suggested limits become a perverse imitation of God's omniscience. And yet, as the devil convinced Adam and Eve to the contrary, there is something wrong. There is something suffering-inducing to transgress the limit God had set on knowledge.
Amen.
Augustine obviously did not believe knowledge was evil, evidenced by his insightful meditation on how knowledge can be turned to vain and perverse curiosity in an attempt to imitate God's omniscience. We must know what the limits of knowledge are and what ought chiefly to characterize it, which will help to put knowledge to its proper use. I had another example in here that I took out, but I'll mention it now, which is to contrast the constructive feats of the Ark on the one hand and the Tower of Babel on the other. Both of those are fairly ingenious feats of architecture. The one, the Ark, was further communicating to Noah and his family his limitations, because it's not like he could put oars in the water. He was just sort of subjected to the way in which the flood waters took them this way or that. But just because man can, let's say, exercise a certain kind of ingenuity and intelligence to construct something like that, doesn't mean he should try to pierce the sky with a tower called Babel, and thus confound, God's command to be fruitful and multiply and to fill up the earth and to spread out upon it.
Colonize Mars.
Right. Yeah. I think that's part of kind of what Bordini feared, which is that, there's something like rah to the last frontier or whatever. That was kind of the motivation for settling the West and all these things, and now Mars is the next thing. But with Musk and others who are transhumanists, they're not really doing good for humanity, even though they say they are. I like that he says, I'm for the humans, but it's like, yeah, but you're kind of for like a human-robot mixture. And I don't really like that so much. Like, I actually think that death is a way in which God humbles us because of the effects of sin. And I don't want to go to whatever hellscape you're promising in terms of eternal life. So,
Hellscape.
Okay. All right. Okay. Part 6. Here's the literary nerdiness coming to the fore. Staring into the Palantir, insights from J.R.R. Tolkien. This section and a conclusion. We're almost there. Thank you for hanging with me. In The Return of the King, J.R.R. Tolkien describes the tragic demise of a certain character called Denethor, the steward of the realm of Gondor. His most cherished son, Boromir, who was part of the Fellowship, died because Boromir became sick with lust for Sauron's ring. His other son, Faramir, had been sorely wounded in battle with the forces of Mordor, and as the darkness of those armies approached their holdout, Minas Tirith, Denethor begins to lose all hope. Even though his son, Faramir, is alive and in need of healing, Denethor resolved that defeat was imminent, and so he decided to take his son to the tombs of the kings and there set himself and his son on fire. He nearly succeeded and did indeed immolate himself, though Faramir was rescued. After Denethor's death, it was discovered that he was in possession of what Tolkien calls a Palantir, which was one of the 7 seeing stones in Middle-earth. Their purpose originally was to communicate across vast...
Isn't Palantir one of the parent companies of Cloud AI?
Yeah.
That's the one they're using in
The cyber.
I didn't get the connection. That came out of.
Well, it may.
Wow.
They don't hide it these days.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, maybe.
The seeing stuff.
Well, we'll see here. Okay.
Don't upload this to YouTube.
Yeah. I'm not saying that, so don't straw man me that. Because, okay, their purpose originally, these Palantir, was to communicate across vast spaces. One would look into the Palantir, and thereby he would encounter others also in possession of the Palantir. It showed images and so forth. At this time in the history of Middle-earth, the Palantir were considered quite dangerous because they were not all accounted for. And those that were accounted for were in the possession of Saruman and Sauron, the Dark Lord. Saruman was corrupted by Sauron through his Palantir, and Denethor, this steward of Gondor, through the very same mechanism, was brought to despair. Now this is the setup for a quote from Gandalf, the wizard. Okay. He says, quote, "Though the stewards deemed that it was a secret kept only by themselves, long ago I guessed that here in the White Tower, one at least of the 7 seeing stones was preserved. In the days of his wisdom, Denethor would not presume to use it to challenge Sauron, knowing the limits of his own strength." So wisdom knows limits. But his wisdom failed, and I fear that as the peril of his own realm grew, he looked into the stone and was deceived. Far too often, I guess, since Boromir departed. He was too great to be seduced by the will of the Dark Power, yet he saw nonetheless only those things which that power permitted him to see. The knowledge which he obtained was doubtless often of service to him, yet the vision of the great might of Mordor that was shown to him fed the despair of his heart until it overthrew his mind. Now, as I recall, the Palantir are described by Tolkien as, they're basically large black balls that have a kind of glossy glass finish. And this is the way that Peter Jackson depicts it in the film. And it looks like a smartphone screen, you know, as he's describing it in the book. And, you know, the smartphone screen is kind of a glass glossy, and then there's this kind of way in which it illuminates and shows you things, whatever. Okay. We might compare the Palantir here then to the aforementioned triad of the internet, the smartphone, and AI assistants. Notice the way in which Tolkien describes Denethor's demise. At first, his wisdom, his prudence, knowing the limits of his own strength, kept from using the Palantir. Wisdom not only recognizes limits, but acknowledges them as positive features of human life. Yet for Denethor, his wisdom failed because of the fear of peril for the realm over which he was steward, and despair over the death of Boromir. And so he resolves to know as a means of protection. He thinks that knowing will keep him safe, and to extend his curiosity through the mechanism of the Palantir, which only exacerbated the despair of the heart and the undoing of his mind. Incidentally, there's also a scene earlier in, I think it's in the Two Towers, when they go to Lothlorien, which is this realm of the elves, and Sam, who is Frodo's chief companion, looks into the mirror of Galadriel, and he sees the scourging of the Shire, which happens at the end of the Return of the King, and he's filled with despair because he knows that it's going to happen, but he obviously can't do anything. Yeah, they do when they go back, right. But it's like the knowing wasn't necessarily in that regard helpful.
It reminds me of like having a video camera 24/7 feed at the USSR, driving all their military might.
Yeah.
On continuous loop.
Right.
You're thinking it's the same army or something.
Yeah, right.
And you're just like, you're in America, you're in total despair.
Yeah, right.
But you think that's real necessarily, but it's manufactured.
Yeah, right. Well, that's true too, and we'll note that, yeah. So in describing the manner in which Denethor stays plugged in, so to speak, Tolkien describes our plight in regard to unrestrained knowing and manufactured omniscience quite masterfully. For so, Tolkien again writes, quote, "The knowledge which Denethor obtained was doubtless often of service to him." And thus many of us say, well, the internet, my smartphone, and AI assistants are often of service to me. Yet, this was the hook to keep Denethor attached to the Palantir, so that Sauron's curated images could sow despair and madness into Denethor's heart and mind. What Tolkien describes is almost something like the way in which endless things to know are algorithmically curated and fed to us. In other words, the algorithmicity. Here, watch this. Here, watch that, based on what you watched before, whatever the case may be. So, again, Sauron is putting in front of Denethor what he wants him to see, enough for him to despair, ultimately. Consider another insight in the same regard from Neil Postman in his book titled Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology. Quote, "Most people believe that technology is a staunch friend. There are two reasons for this. First, technology is a friend. It makes life easier, cleaner, and longer. Can anyone ask more of a friend? And second, because of its lengthy, intimate, and inevitable relationship with culture, technology does not invite a close examination of its own consequences, because the exercise of power may just be another natural product. This is the way it's supposed to develop. We're supposed to build a tower to the heavens. Did you know that? Right? See, so it doesn't invite a close examination of its own consequences because it already has this close relation to culture. It is the kind of friend that asks for trust and obedience, which most people are inclined to give because its gifts are truly bountiful. It gave him good images, right? In the case of Denethor and the Palantir. But of course, there is a dark side to this friend. Its gifts are not without a heavy cost. Stated in the most dramatic terms, the accusation can be made that the uncontrolled growth of technology, or to say it in a Guardinian way, the ignorant, thoughtless growth of technology, destroys the vital sources of our humanity. It creates a culture without a moral foundation, because the ability to do something outpaces the question of whether it ought to be done. It undermines certain mental processes, interior life, and social relations that make human life worth living. And I think we've seen social relations basically sacrificed on the altar of my friends on my phone or whatever. Technology, in some, Postman concludes, is both friend and enemy. It may very well be that our knowing machines and this manufactured omniscience are often of service to us, but who is calculating the negative reciprocation? Or is it even calculable? It is beyond the scope of tonight's consideration to get into that, but we may discuss it. But I'm just saying I didn't include it here. But by way of experience and observation, it is clear to me that we should not count it an absolute good that we can now know all that we can know. Our interior life is tormented by our own thoughtless and ignorant participation with knowing machines that attempt to manufacture a divine attribute like omniscience in man, even as the creation of certain tools may try to manufacture omnipotence, so to say, in man. I know that I can do more than I can actually do. What is the solution? Part 7, to conclude, rejoicing in creatureliness. So far as I'm concerned, the solution is not to be found in tech fasts or setting boundaries of use. It needn't even include, not having a smartphone. That's the route that I have gone because of my own disposition and so forth. That's just what I've chosen to do. So I don't necessarily think that the solution primarily is found in those same things, though, tech fasts or setting of boundaries. However helpful in mitigating these measures may be. I think the first part of the solution, the first part of the balm of healing, is to accept with gratitude that certain kinds of limitations ought not to be exceeded, but accepted and rejoiced in. In invention, man must keep in dialogue with creation, must invent and use mechanisms that, as they are used, put him in remembrance of his place within the world over which God has set him as a steward, not a master. And should he use mechanisms that admit less friction, are less communicative to him of his creatureliness, of his human limitations, to be on his guard, respecting their effects, not thinking that they're just being used, so to say, without suggestion. As it pertains to those inventions that suggest the idea that we can stretch and exceed our natural limits of knowing, I do think there needs to be an excess of care. I do not think we understand the power we wield, or, to say it the other way, the power that wields us in the triad of the internet, smartphone, and AI assistance, nor then do we acknowledge the negative reciprocation they create in us. This is not meant to be a tech is bad talk. I mean, I wrote this on a computer, for one thing. But it is rather to be a piercing consideration of the way in which what we create can often, unbeknownst to us, suggest by way of an embedded idea that we can live limitlessly in disregard of our creatureliness. We do so to our detriment, and in regard to matters related to curiosity and mechanisms that allow it to go forward unrestrained, we torment our interiority, are brought to despair of heart and the potential overthrow of our mind, and thereafter other exterior faculties. And so let us then turn our heart, mind, soul, imagination, interiority to their right use. First as sub-knowers to the knower, or knowledge and wisdom itself. And thereafter recognize that like our drive to create, so our drive to know is to be done to the glory of God. For our resident Calvinist over here, everything is to be done to the glory of God, right? And this is eternal life, Jesus says, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. And if it is eternal life to know God and His Son Jesus Christ, then such is also good and needed for this temporal life. God grant that unrestrained curiosity and manufactured omniscience do not deteriorate such a capability of knowing God and His Son Jesus Christ. And that then we go on from knowing God and His divine revelation in His Son to an order of knowing in this life according to our own particular stations, our own place, our own responsibilities, vocations, in short, knowing according to our own human limitations. All right. Thank you.